morning, good afternoon, good evening, no matter where you are, whenever you're watching this. This is Floating in Dreams. Today's video is going to be a tea time chat, and today's chat is going to be about why I think eyeshadow palettes and the focus on that is slowly killing the beauty industry. Controversial topic, I'm sure. Welcome to everybody watching today. Thank you so very much for joining me. Today's video is going to be a bit of a controversial one. I think the title is perhaps a little bit stronger worded than I really feel about this topic, but yeah, I think that there is just too much of a focus on eyeshadow palettes, and that's why we all feel so overwhelmed and things are just not, we're just not in a good space when it comes to like beauty content, I feel. So that's why I thought I could discuss with you what role I feel eyeshadow palettes play and have played in like the boom of beauty content online and what I feel has been happening and going on, and then also taking a look at the future. So that's what we've got going on today. In case you're new here, hi, my name is Maaike. I live in the Netherlands. I like to come on here to chat about eyeshadow palettes, Essence and Catrice reviews, and getting the use out of my makeup. And because I have fair skin with a cool to neutral undertone, I deem myself a snow angel. So if you'd like to join the Snow Angel Club, click subscribe down below and join my little family. Tea time chat wouldn't be a tea time chat without some tea, and today's tea isn't a hot tea. I make myself actual iced tea. Homemade iced tea is one of my favorite things in the summer, and we're having a heat wave. As I'm filming this, it's going to be 33 degrees today. A lot of people think, oh, these people in Europe are just complaining, but we don't have ACs. I'm filming this with all of my windows and doors closed, A, because of noise, and 2, to try and keep some of the heat out of my house. But I have south-facing floor-to-ceiling windows in my kitchen. It's like a greenhouse in here, okay? I make myself iced tea. And whenever I post this on my socials, but I like usually show this, people ask me how I make it, but I just make tea, green tea in this case. I just make a pot of hot tea, pop some sprigs of mint in there, and then when it's cooled down to room temperature, I pop in 2 slices of lemon and stick it in the fridge. Cooking recipe, the recipe is done. Let's get to the discussion of today's topic. Why eyeshadow palettes are slowly but surely just killing the joy I have as well for creating beauty content. So yeah, it may be a bit strange for me to come on here to chat about why I think eyeshadow palettes are killing the industry. The reason why I say this is because I love chatting about eyeshadow palettes. I really feel that eyeshadow palettes are some of my favorite things to try out, which is why I love coming on here to chat about them, to review them for you guys. But I feel there is just too much of a focus on eyeshadow palette related content, on reviews, on brands releasing palettes, that it's just also at the same time killing my joy for it. But before we get into it, I would like to start us off with a bit of a history lesson. So that's the first point I want to make in today's video. What I want to discuss with you is sort of like the history of palettes. So I remember when I first got into makeup, this was around 2008, 2009, eyeshadow palettes weren't a thing. Like they just were non-existent. The only thing we had were singles, and then maybe up to like a quad or a quintet, like those like Dior, Chanel kind of things. But most people just had singles, and that was it. So there was really not that much going on in terms of like this focus on like pretty palettes and things like that. And a lot of the makeup content at the time on YouTube and that I was watching in terms of like beauty blogs and stuff, it was far more about like techniques, and it wasn't so much product focused. So it wasn't like you need this product to create this look. It was like more that Kevin Aquan kind of like, here's a technique, just use a gold eyeshadow of your choice, you know? So it was far more aimed at teaching techniques rather than products, single-use products that you had to get. And at the time as well, palettes that existed were very much aimed at makeup artists who needed a lot of shades for like shows and doing makeup on lots of different people, and very often they would put them together themselves. Because palettes for consumers just weren't really a thing. I think actually I remember watching a video way back in the day. I started watching Wayne Goss religiously when I first got into makeup. Like a lot of the things I do when it comes to eyeshadow applications are tips I picked up from him really early on. And he also really sort of talked about how his work as an MUA required him to have certain shades, but that you as a consumer didn't need it, and all of that. And he was like, you know, pressing lipsticks into palettes and showing things that he was using in his kit. And I think that that's really something that was a really big difference between makeup for professionals and makeup for the average consumer. I think there just used to be much more of a gap between those two worlds. And I think that social media has sort of merged those things more together. And that definitely social media is partly the reason why there was this like shift to focusing more on like, you need this product to get this look, and then creators attaching their name to it and selling that to you. I think that's definitely part of how things have developed over time. So then, of course, we got the Urban Decay Naked Palette. I think the Urban Decay Naked Palette was like really the first big launch that was an eyeshadow palette with 12 pans that became really popular for the consumer market. And again, if my memory serves me right, I remember Lisa Eldridge actually saying in a video years ago how these kind of Urban Decay type palettes isn't something that makeup artists would use at shoots, because they would much rather curate their own palettes, which is why you would see a lot of professional makeup artists using like MAC singles and like creating their own palettes with things so that they could take the shades that they needed for a job or anything like that. And I think that, again, there used to be this split between what people used to do, and now I think it's just those two worlds seem to have merged more so in what kind of products we actually use. So that's a bit of a history lesson that I wanted to share with you. So yeah, eyeshadow palettes are quite a recent development. It just hasn't been around for a long time. It's like maybe 10, 15 years or so. Like when I first started my blog, I wouldn't have been able to do an entire month just on eyeshadow palettes. And the reason why I actually do an eyeshadow palette month is actually something I started on my blog before I was even filming a lot of videos, because I always fell behind. I fell behind on writing my reviews, and then I would organize this month where every review I would post would be eyeshadow palette related, and it would allow me to just catch up with some of the content I was making. But the second point I want to make is to sort of discuss why I think eyeshadow palettes became so popular. So I think that especially when eyeshadow palettes first became a thing, I'm sure there were like limited editions around before the Urban Decay Naked Palette. I remember Too Faced used to be a brand that had like pin-up boudoir style that they used to do way, like this is like 2008 Too Faced I'm talking about, with like these frills and like fairies on them. So there were things around, but they were very often limited edition Christmas releases. And we only got limited editions for like Christmas once a year usually. I think it was MAC who only did like limited editions every 6 weeks, but that was also more like product based and not so much packaging based, because I remember years ago the focus with eyeshadow palettes was all about the packaging. It had to be interesting, it had to capture people's attention, it didn't have to look boring. And very often with these limited editions, however, the quality just wasn't the same. But yeah, one of the draws I think for eyeshadow palettes for average consumers ended up being the fact that you would get so many more shades for a more reasonable price point. Very often, singles were just incredibly expensive. A MAC single at the time wasn't around the $5 mark that you see singles going for today. Over here, by the way, MAC singles have never been lowered in price. They are still at the price point where they used to be at. A single pan of MAC eyeshadow was $13 a pop. I believe that was around the price point where they were at. And then, of course, we got all of these brands like Makeup Geek offering single shadows at a much cheaper price point, and then buying a single versus a palette became a little bit more manageable again. But think of Urban Decay Naked Palettes and the fact that they charge like what, 55 euros for one? You cannot buy 12 MAC single shadows for that price point, you would have to pay double, even more than that. I mean, if it's like 12 times 12, you know, that's like 144 euros for 12 shades. Whereas Urban Decay was giving you a similar amount of shades for half the price point. So that's where I think a lot of the appeal came from at first. I think that one other thing that palettes have going for themselves at first when these things became popular was that there was a lot less product in the eyeshadow pans, meaning you could use it up a little bit quicker. A standard eyeshadow pan is usually 1.2 grams of product, and that takes a lot of time to use up. So again, if you were a consumer, that just wasn't something that you could use up. So a lot of palettes actually have around like 0.8, 0.7 sometimes. I think Lorac even only has like 0.5 grams of product in their like very tiny pans. There are, however, now palettes on the market that have up to 2 grams of product in them. The larger Natasha Denona palettes are known for doing that. But yeah, I think that because palettes had more shades, less product, at a much cheaper price point than buying all of these things as a single and creating your own palette, that was sort of like the breakthrough that a palette offered consumers at first. Plus, it was very easy to use. It took the brain space out of putting a palette together yourself. So if perhaps you didn't really understand color theory all that well, or if you didn't really know how to put things together like you would have to do with a single, the brand now does the job for you, and you have a selection of colors put together that you can use together. So the palette is doing the thinking for you. And I mean, I remember, I'm going to show you this, of course, in other videos as well, but if you look at some of the older eyeshadow palettes, especially limited edition ones, we don't even get a color story. Like, a color story just wasn't a thing. I think that was like a revolution around like 2014, 15 maybe, but I remember some of the first eyeshadow palettes I ever bought just didn't have a color story, and you were always left with 1 or 2 shades that made you go like, what am I supposed to do with you? And not just because you couldn't use them because your makeup skills weren't great. It was just like a random purple somewhere, you know? And you're like, wait, what am I supposed to do with that? Yeah, palettes became really popular, and I think that as brands realized how popular these things were, they started to milk it for all it was worth. So my third point that I want to make is why eyeshadow palettes have become a little bit problematic, I feel. So I'm going to take this from different perspectives because I think there is a brand perspective, a consumer perspective, there's the makeup artist perspective, but then I think there's also the perspective coming from creators. So as a brand, I feel that at the moment, if you don't have an eyeshadow palette, you're not a good brand. Like, that seems to be the thing. Like, a lot of brands, if they start out, they make sure they have an eyeshadow palette. Not all of them, if they already have a lot of financial backing. Something like Fenty that already like is like funded by Sephora in a way, they started with foundations. But a lot of lines that you see drop, especially indie brands, seem to bring out an eyeshadow palette first, or at least the first time you really hear them being talked about is when they release an eyeshadow palette. And I think that if brands don't have a good palette, it seems to just not create as much traction. It's also very often an introductory product that a first-time buyer will be interested in, it seems. However, I feel like eyeshadow is just not your most essential makeup product. Like, if you look at it for like the general public, like that I started my love for makeup with eyeshadow, I think I'm like the odd one out. I think most people start with foundation and mascara, not eyeshadow. Like, that's the last thing they add. I kind of did everything in reverse. But yeah, eyeshadow was like my first love, the first thing I got into. And that's what I really, really enjoyed. But yeah, I think that actually, when it comes to mascara and foundation, they are actually better products for a brand to focus on because they have a much higher turnover rate. You're more likely to repurchase a mascara or a foundation because they are like actually everyday use products, whereas an eyeshadow palette is very difficult to use up still, especially because we have so much. So I think from a business perspective, this entire focus on, you know, eyeshadow palettes is sort of like a double-edged sword, where on the one hand, you need a good palette to draw in the attention and to create popularity and to create traction on social media, but at the same time, it doesn't create the longevity your brand is going to need to stick out in the long run. So that's why I feel from a brand perspective, brands like this eyeshadow palette thing we've got going on, not a good thing. Not a good thing. And then the consumer perspective here is just, there is just so much to choose from. And I'm sort of like trying to help you to figure out like what is actually worth it and not. But as a content creator, well, I'll get to that in a minute. This focus of eyeshadow palettes just isn't healthy as well. But yeah, when it comes to, for instance, limited editions, those sometimes get really hyped up. But this was a point I saw a makeup artist make on TikTok the other day, so this is not my idea. And I don't know her username handle, I'm afraid. It only like you're scrolling through TikTok and you don't know who you're actually watching, I feel. But she was mentioning how limited edition eyeshadow palettes are very often lesser quality products because for the brand to still make money off of it, they only have a limited window in which they can recoup their investment. So that's why they very often stick lesser quality product in these limited edition eyeshadow palettes just to be able to afford it. So that's why I think consumer be aware that, you know, limited edition eyeshadow palettes, even though they look pretty, may not be your best bang for your buck, just saying. And I think that as a consumer, you also need to be very well aware of what suits you and what goes with your aesthetic, your coloring, and what's gonna work for you. I think that that's also where a lot of my content is coming from, as I've realized over time just a lot better what works for me. Because I have more of a neutral undertone, I can get away with most things. I can wear super warm tone things. I just think I don't always look the best in it. I mean, I'm wearing a very warm toned lipstick today because I can and I can pull it off. But not everything is going to look right on everyone. And I think that as a consumer, you really almost have to gatekeep what is going to work for you. And very often it's just, you know, hyped up content, but just because it's hyped up, it doesn't mean it's going to work for you personally. So you always have to bear that in mind. And I also think that a lot of palettes that are created just aren't that workable from a consumer perspective. Some of the brands out there nowadays really focus on pigmentation, but I feel at the cost of having good blendability and like usability. It's just not always very user-friendly to have these boom bow pow kind of eyeshadows that a lot of people are now hyping up. And I also think that because of eyeshadow palettes like are so trend heavy that in order to come up with a new thing and a new thing and a new thing, brands have also pushed color stories into a realm where you now look at an orange and you no longer think, ooh, that's an orange, that's intense. No, we now consider an orange to be a neutral. At least some people do. I'm not saying I am, but if you look at the Naked line from Urban Decay, what looks naked now versus 10, 15 years ago when those first palettes came out is a very different concept. And that's only because we have been conditioned to no longer view something like a Naked One as a good color story. Just because it needs to be that next step. Like, what's the next thing? And that's what everybody's been looking for. So is that still wearable for every day for everyone? I don't think so. And again, as a consumer, I think that's something you need to be aware of. And then finally, for the consumer perspective, I think that before we got this entire focus on eyeshadow palettes, like this craze, I think it was easier to keep your collection focused on what you needed personally. With eyeshadow palettes, there's also just a lot of overflow. There are shades in palettes that are repeated over and over. The matte white, the matte black, the shimmering gold, like they're in every single palette. So if you have a few, you're probably going to end up with a lot of doubles in your collection. Sure, there's going to be variations in those shades, but you don't need that many of those shades, I think. So what do you essentially need? And I think if you just have a couple of singles, you can actually keep it a lot more focused. So before, the makeup market was a lot more user-friendly, I think. Now, the next perspective I wanted to go into is more like the makeup enthusiast, the makeup artist. So what I have seen a lot is that as using palettes became the norm, that this even affected makeup artistry, and it I think that's really a driving factor of these like really dramatic looks that we are seeing pushed around on social media, especially when it became very popular on Instagram. I feel by now the idea of being able to do good makeup seems to be these really dramatic, overly saturated, filtered makeup looks, whereas that has nothing to do with good makeup. One of the reasons why the only person I pretty much still watch for actual makeup tips is Lisa Eldridge, is because she gives me actual workable tips that I can adapt into my own makeup routine, and not just like, this is how I do eyeshadow on my eyes and this is how you should do it too, which is what a lot of social media content creators do. So I feel there's a really big gap nowadays between like just the makeup enthusiast who likes to do makeup on themselves and people who can really make makeup work on multiple people. I think there's very much a difference there. So I feel that this dramatic, like the usage of eyeshadow palettes has really sort of affected not only the way we do eyeshadow and what is considered to be a good makeup look, a good eyeshadow look, but it's also affected then other areas of what makeup should look like. Because if you have this really intense eye look, then of course you need to make sure your brows match as well. So that's where the Insta brow for me at least comes from. The intense contouring and highlight trends that we saw going around for a while, because you're gonna need something to offset the bold makeup that you've done with a makeup palette with the rest of your look. So not only are we pushing color stories to new extremes, we also push the makeup looks that we wear to new extremes. And if that's you, if you love doing your makeup like that, you do you. But I know that if I were to show up to work like that, I'm gonna have someone tell me to take off my makeup. I mean, wearing a red lip to work for some people is already a bridge too far. Not because they don't like it, but because other people are gonna tell them that it doesn't look professional. And so there's this huge clash between what is acceptable in a professional environment versus what is accepted as like a creative makeup environment. So I feel there's different things there, and we just need to remember that not everybody does makeup for Instagram or TikTok or YouTube. There are people who wear other makeup outside of this realm. So the final point I want to make here is the perspective of the content creator. So as a content creator myself, I can give a little bit more insight on this. So I am always behind with my eyeshadow palette reviews, and that's because I really want to make sure I use every single shade in a palette. One of my biggest pet peeves is when I see other content creators giving their review on an eyeshadow palette when they've done one look and they've only used like what, 2 or 3 shades sometimes, but then they will tell you how good they think it is. Okay, I definitely want to make sure I use every single shade in a palette, not only to use all the shades, but also to push myself out of my comfort zone, to try shades I normally may not be able to try, that I'm not enticed to try. But that can take a long time, and when you don't get your eyeshadow palette review up like today, preferably before anybody can buy it, so that people can go to your video to see how it works, so they can decide whether they want to buy it, your video is just going to be lost in the shuffle. So as content creators, and this is one of the reasons why I think, you know, eyeshadow palette content can be very overwhelming, and why it's slowly but surely just no longer a sustainable model that we've got going on here, is that unless you receive something in PR, it's just not going to work out. So I think that right now, a lot of the focus is very much on how things swatch and not so much how they perform on eyes. And I don't think there's just a lot of people I no longer trust when it comes to eyeshadow palette reviews personally. For a while we had a brush swatch trend, but that kind of died. So I think that there's just, you know, I don't think that as creators it's like do your due diligence. I mean, that's part of it for me, but I think it's also down to, you know, the way social media works, that is like part of the problem. So right now I would like to go into the 4th part of this video and share with you like a roundup of all of my thoughts. So while I love chatting about eyeshadow palettes, I mean, this is a love I've had for years, and luckily those videos do pretty well on my YouTube channel, but over on my blog, most of my eyeshadow palette reviews just don't do that well. It's something, it's very easy to chat about. It's very visually pleasing to hold it up and talk about it. But at the end of the day, I'm not a makeup artist. I cannot teach you about makeup techniques. I can show you what I do on my eyes, but apart from like a handful of times where I've done other people's makeup, I know I cannot tell you how you can create the looks that I make work for yourselves. So I do show you in a lot of videos how I do my makeup, and I show this is also one of the reasons why I include looks whenever I review a palette, because I want to show you what it looks like on me. But I also find that those videos just don't really do very well, because my ability to teach you things in terms of how to do your makeup, that's just not a skill I have, and I would recommend you go to Lisa Eldridge. I think Wayne Goss still does as well, some of these videos. I've stopped watching a lot of that too, I have to say. Ultimately, what it boils down to for me is that the turnover of products and the need for brands to constantly renew what is going on in their makeup lines is partly instigated by this need of having a makeup palette, an eyeshadow palette to put yourself on the map. And I think that that can just be really harmful for brands as well. I mean, just look at a brand like ColourPop. By now they are just repeating the things they've already done in different packaging with a different pan size, so that you have to rebuy all of your ColourPop palettes if you still want to be able to mix and match them. I mean, I'm pretty sure that that's how you can make money, but in order to keep the momentum going, they would have been so much better off if they had just slowed down releases to begin with. But yeah, you know, people just get tired of things if you do it that way. And I think that that's another thing that a lot of brands need to take into account. I think there was a lot of backlash when ABH, of course, tried to do this a couple of years ago, and they definitely slowed down how much makeup or eyeshadow palettes they started releasing as a result. I think that also by now it's just really, really difficult to still come up with a color story that hasn't been done before. The innovation really lies with small indie brands at the moment, it seems. But they often only produce small batches. They probably do it by hand. They are 1 or 2 person businesses, so the scale is a lot smaller. So I feel they can also do a lot more, because they also don't have to appeal to this mass market of people. Which, for instance, a brand like Urban Decay is trying to do, because they're sold globally. So if you're a single, you can't really compare like a small indie brand versus these like really big corporations that are trying to appeal to the masses. But I do think actually that here we also need to be careful, because there are indie brands who don't make the shadows themselves, but they buy them from manufacturers and then put them together in themselves in a palette with their packaging design. Not saying that they don't create the colors or that they don't create the color stories. There's still a process behind it, but they don't make the palettes themselves, and those are usually the more affordable indie brands for sure. You know, when it comes to making eyeshadow palettes, I think for indie brands it's definitely a labor of love that they've got going on, so it takes a lot more time, and with some consumers I feel this also creates backlash for those smaller indie brands, because people are used to these bigger brands that have a lot more turnover and just have a much quicker like overturn time. I see this a lot in comments that people get, or the type of communication that indie brands have to send out on their social media pages to say like, people, please be patient. You've made a pre-order. We're gonna try and do our best to get it out as quickly as possible. But we have a, you know, processing time of so many days, and then people can sometimes get pretty angry with them. I'm like, you're trying to sell, you're buying from a one-person show here. Like, I didn't mind waiting for my Shrouded freaking bats, but yeah, they did definitely underestimate how popular that palette would be, of course. But yeah, I just feel that then again creates backlash for the brand, and that's just really sad to see that happening. So where is this going to go? What I hope. I just joined TikTok a couple of months ago, and I'm seeing a lot more focus on makeup techniques on there, rather than this is a product and this is how you have to use it. I think that that is really, really great, to not see people actually holding up a product and saying like, you need this shade with this name. Just saying like, I'm using a cream colored eyeshadow to set my base. You can use any cream colored eyeshadow that you have lying about to set your base. You don't need the one that I'm using, for instance. I like to see that we're getting a lot more smaller palettes again. Yes, there are still some bigger palettes around, but we're seeing a lot more 5 pans, quads, and mini palettes, which tells me that we're going in the right direction. There are also quite a few brands that are slowing down releases, that are not trying to take part in this rat race anymore. ABH, I'm loving that you've finally done another palette, but you haven't done one in a while, so I think that that's good as well. I also think that the focus for like right now, trend-wise, it's much more on like natural everyday makeup with all of the skin tints and like the laminated brow thing that's going on. There are a lot more clean beauty brands that are being talked about. A lot of cream products are currently really popular. So we're dialing it down. We're dialing it down. We're no longer going for this full beat of glam makeup. And I think that that's also going to affect the eyeshadow that we wear, that maybe just a wash of color on the lid is going to be popular again, and all you need is a ColourPop Super Shock and Ritz. That's my favorite one and done shadow, in case you were wondering. And I also think that what factors in here right now is the popularity of skincare. There's a lot of skincare content being pushed. Can skincare be a trend? I think taking care of your skin is supposed to happen anyways, but it's really a hype at the moment, and I think it's also, again, pushing people away from this really intense makeup look that we were seeing a couple of years ago, and it just like affects makeup trends as well, this focus on skincare. I think that this hopefully will also mean that people move away from these super pigmented, high impact shadows that we've seen people pushing a lot in recent years. Very often I now see creators who don't even use eyeshadow, but just a bit of bronzer and their cream blush, and that's their eye look, and I think that that's a really good one as well. You don't need an eyeshadow palette to create an eye look, is what I'm trying to say. So I think that there's definitely some trends going on that can take this frenzy when it comes to eyeshadow palettes into another direction. I personally have been affected by it. I have bought just far fewer eyeshadow palettes in the past year than I have done in recent years. I'm trying to temper it down. I still have a lot of eyeshadow palettes, but like I said, it's because I have just hung on to things that I know I love, and there's nothing wrong with that, I feel. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from with this. Maybe next year we can do another eyeshadow palette month, because I love chatting about it for sure. And I don't think it's gonna die completely, but I do feel there's a wave, a changing wave in the times, you could say. And I think trends, of course, come in cycles. And I'm sure maybe a few years down the line, we're going to get really intense eyeshadow again. But I'm definitely seeing a different focus right now. So yeah, thank you so very much for joining me today. Let me know your thoughts in a comment down below. Thumbs up the video if you liked it. Subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more about me. I make several videos a week. We still have a lot of eyeshadow palette related content coming this month for sure. And I hope to see you in my next video. Take care, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.